My personal inquiry project was a very difficult one, mainly because of all the other questions it posed, and it's the sort of project that one could spend a very long time on, going into depth about all the neurons and synapses and parts of the brain that help us make choices, or hardly any time at all, making a decision guided by one's religion. This year, I decided to study human nature, and why we have it, why we have that choice. Human nature, by definition, is our emotions, the choices we make, and that freedom to choose. My own opinions and beliefs on this topic are influenced by my Christian faith, but I also provide this hopefully adequate information for you guys to form your own opinions. It's been a very long journey these past few months, digging out information from podcasts, online journals, and many other places. Along the way, I've learned many things, and I've been able to put things in perspective. I've changed. I've become more thankful for things we so often take for granted. Miracles before our very eyes, and behind them. I hope I can show you guys just how amazing things like the brain and its processes are. Without further ado, I present to you my journey through neuroscience, philosophy, and theology. The first step in understanding something is knowing how it works. So we begin in the human brain, the control center of our daily lives, with neurological anatomy as our guide. According to Mayfield Clinic, an international leader in the neurological sciences that has been helping patients since 1937, there's the cerebrum, which is the central part of the brain, and one of its primary jobs is to keep our reasoning and our emotions going. Within this, there are several cerebral fissures, which is a natural sort of trench, or divider between sections of the brain, which separate the cerebrum into lobes, which are basically major areas of the brain. Two of these lobes are the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe runs our behavior, emotions, judgment, planning, and problem solving, whereas the temporal lobe puts our sequencing and organization on track. There's another part of the brain called the amygdala, and that's the part that's in charge of processing emotions. According to Daniel Goleman, author, psychologist, and science journalist of SIY Leadership Institute, there's also the basal ganglia, which is the base of the brain, and this part observes daily life and pulls decision-making rules from it to govern later decisions. These are just a few of the fundamental elements out of the many, many parts of the human mind. Shelley Rowe, international speaker, professional engineer, leadership expert, PE, says that within these lobes, the base, and everywhere else in the brain and entire nervous system, there are the fundamental building blocks of the mind, neurons. These cells connect together throughout the brain, sending signals back and forth almost instantly. There wouldn't be a brain at all without them. They also carry information perceived by the senses back to the brain to make decisions with, and then carry the decision from the brain to the rest of the body to be executed. These little guys have multiple parts as well, axons and dendrites. Axons are the main arms protruding from the neuron, and extending from other regions of the neuron, like branches, are dendrites. The dendrite receives messages from other neurons, and the axon sends out the message to the next neurons using neurotransmitters, which are kind of like messengers that are discharged from the axon when a message from another neuron is detected. These neurons crisscross our brains and bodies, sending signals and neurotransmitters back and forth constantly. The paths that are taken the most, signifying what we do and take in the most, become highways in the brain. And these highways represent how we act, what we do most, etc. As for neurochemistry, neurotransmitters have a tremendous effect on our choices. One type of neurotransmitter is called serotonin, and according to a study conducted by expert moral decision-making researcher Molly Crockett, higher serotonin levels are associated with empathy, whereas lower levels cause things like aggression. When one is depressed, these serotonin systems get messed up and change our decisions. Dopamine is another chemical that plays a role in our choices, according to a study done by Professor Ming Su of the Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley. More dopamine means more risk-taking, which a little of can be good, but too much results in reckless behavior. In addition to this anatomy, there are two main ways your brain makes decisions, according to Professor Kahneman of the University of Jerusalem and the late Amos Tversky from Stanford University. There's your conscious, rational part that analyzes problems and comes up with logical answers. That's the part you're consciously aware of. It's great at problem solving, but it's also slow and requires lots of energy. The other part, your instinctive and fast part, is powerful, unconscious, mostly responsible for what we do, say, and believe, and it's where we make the majority of our choices. Sometimes this causes decisions that should be passed through the logical part to cause mistakes. These mistakes are called cognitive biases, and they have an effect on everything, from the way we spend to what we say. When we make these mistakes, our slow, logical part likes to make excuses. But the basis of all this decision-making, after the anatomy of the human nervous system, is actually our emotional opinions, not just pros and cons, contrary to popular belief, says Christine Comerford, businesswoman, author, and entrepreneur. We are an extremely emotional species, as 90% of the choices we make are made in the subconscious mind. There are more cellular passages into the conscious mind from the subconscious mind than vice versa, like comparing a one-way, 6-lane highway to a little dirt path. Basically, the main point is that one needs to know what something is and how it works before fully diagnosing why one has it. One cannot just jump into a very complicated topic and immediately understand why something is. One must look at how it works, what it does, what it means, etc. In addition to this, learning about the basics of human nature gives one more time to really ponder over why one has it. Some may say that how our brain makes decisions is, in fact, not connected at all to why we have that choice, and they make a good case. I have realized this along the way, but the reason I did not change my essential and guiding questions is because researching about the overall topic of human nature gave me time to subconsciously think about why we have it. And that extra time to think that researching gives us is directly connected to why we have human nature. The next step on our journey, since we have established a basic understanding of human nature, is in the world of philosophy, a field of study so simple at first, but then so complex. Philosophy is all about posing questions that are very difficult to answer, and making them so that when one answer is brought up in response to a question, even more questions can be posed in response to the answer. I have decided to study philosophy in addition to neuroscience because it's a very unique study, and it helps me to dig deeper and really understand why we have human nature. Science is easy in some respects because it has single, mathematical, and systematic answers to questions, and its job is to answer questions and help people fall asleep at night. But unlike the sciences, philosophy is the art of creating very difficult and oftentimes frustrating conundrums that tend to keep people awake at night. Some of these questions, according to author Robert Greene, could include things like, why do we exist? What is the meaning of life? And is what we see real? When it comes to human nature and the decisions we make, many sources, including Robert Greene, came up with questions like, do we really have free will? What's the best moral system? What makes someone evil? Who defines good and evil, and what even are they? And many others. These questions are good for deciding why we have human nature, because they bring up points you may not have thought of. Based on my research, if we can map out most of the brain and see how it works, and notice that everyone else's brain works more or less the same way, do we really have free will? Or are all of our decisions a collection of predictable phenomena that will happen because of how our brains are structured? According to Christian beliefs, if God knows everything that will happen, do we have free will? Sources like the science blog IO9 ask things like, who even gets to say what the best moral system is? What is our definition of evil? To some, these topics and definitions can be blurred lines. Just to give an example of a place to start, Merriam-Webster says that good can mean well-founded, true, honorable, virtuous, right, commendable, and benevolent. But it can also mean satisfactory, agreeable, pleasant, profitable, and advantageous. At first glance, most of the words in the second list are used to describe bargaining, money, or the quality of something. But could they be used to describe a person's actions? See what I mean? Philosophy digs deeper. I already have these questions answered based on my theological beliefs, but I wanted to provide you guys with this information to help you make your own opinions about choices and human nature. And pondering these things helped me to ask questions I never thought to ask. Questions that bring new levels of thinking. Questions that establish what good and bad are, as well as other things that must be thought about before answering why we have human nature. Hopefully they will help you dig deeper too, and really think about this whole human nature thing. In order to form complete opinions about why we have human nature, we need to comprehend it on every level, and asking these deep questions will do this. One can't just jump into deciphering why we have the ability to choose for ourselves without establishing a few things first. And this is what the questions posed by philosophy do. Now our journey takes us into the world of religion and theology. I decided to choose 4 major international religions to study: Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism, in addition to Christianity, because I was curious as to what their outlook was on human nature and why we have it. Christianity says a lot about human nature, and it entails even an entire history about how human nature came about. The book of Genesis in the Bible says that God created us in His image, and in the beginning, people had a completely righteous human nature. What I mean by this is that anyone's reaction to anything was always going to be good. When I say good, I mean the Bible's definition of good, found in the 10 Commandments, which include having no gods before God, making no image to bow down to, not misusing God's name, keeping the Sabbath holy, honoring your father and mother, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony about a neighbor, and do not covet. Technically, all of these things fall under the golden rule, which is to do unto others as you would have done to you. Anyhow, there were these nearly perfect people who were made to care after all the animals and to glorify God above. God placed them in a garden that contained everything they needed and instructed them not to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yet Satan tempted the people, and they ate from the fruit. They gained knowledge of good and evil, but they were also banished from the garden. From that point on, humanity has been falling away from God, and our nature now is to serve ourselves. But this can be improved or worsened by what we do and say, experience. When God will return to earth and our world as we know it will end, eternity will begin, and those that trust the Lord will experience the original human nature for the rest of eternity. This is what I firmly believe in, but I was curious as to what other religions thought. Buddhism, according to PBS, talks about the Four Noble Truths, which explain that ignorance and desire are at the root of suffering, that the way to reach the end of suffering in all lives is through nirvana, a transcendent state free of pain and the reincarnation cycle, and the fact that the Noble Eightfold Path is how to achieve nirvana. The Noble Eightfold Path contains right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And then there's karma, which unlike other religions, karma is the actions seen collectively that one does in a life, which can be good, bad, or neutral. Karma can be thought of as Buddhism's definition of good and bad. Good karma can simply be not doing bad things, or doing actual good deeds like kindness, generosity, etc. And these things bring about long-term happiness. Bad karma is things like lying, stealing, etc., and they bring about long-term unhappiness. The weight of these actions, which is the determiner of how they're judged, is dictated by 5 areas: frequent, repetitive action, determined intentional action, action performed without regret, action against extraordinary people, action towards those who have helped one in the past. So essentially, how good or bad something is determined by its impact upon others and the world. There is also neutral karma, which has no weight and includes things like breathing, eating, and sleeping. Those that have good karma will be reborn into one of the fortunate realms: man, gods, and demigods. However, if you have bad karma, you will be most likely reborn into an unfortunate realm and experience untold suffering, which includes animals, ghosts, and the underworld. Out of these 6, man is the only realm that can achieve nirvana. These are the basics of Buddhism, but there are more details that go more in depth on the subject of good and evil. According to SGI, which is a community-based Buddhist organization, good and evil are innate things in us that will always be there. Thus, Buddhism can't label people as good or bad, since we're all capable of righteous works and horrid evils. Our next stop is Islam. The Islamic teachings, according to PBS, say that people are accountable for their behavior during their lifetime and will be judged accordingly on Judgment Day. Everyone, according to BBC, has the innate ability to tell the difference between good and evil, known as fitra. Islam also teaches that we all have free will and must choose between good, following Allah or God, or evil, following the temptations of Shaitan, the devil. A life is essentially a large period of testing and temptations, but Allah will forgive people if they are truly sorry. All are supposed to follow Allah's example of justice, mercy, and forgiveness, and humanity was made to serve God's will. Yet, the Quran, the Muslim holy book, describes human nature as frail and faltering. Since we were given many freedoms, we are more prone to pride and rebellion. While all things follow Allah's command automatically, people have a choice. Thus, our moral struggles exist. According to Patheos, an online religion resource commentary and encyclopedia, we were given 3 gifts, separating us from all the animals. The ability to tell the difference between the truth and the lies, a free will to choose either one, and the ability to worship through speech. These gifts make us superior and noble out of all the creations, but we are subsequently prone to temptation. Britannica says this based off of Islam. Man by nature is very timid. When evil befalls him, he panics, but when good things come to him, he prevents them from reaching others. Britannica also says that on the last day, everyone's deeds will be accounted for and all will be judged. The Quran says that people who do good will have their reward in heaven with Allah, while people who don't won't be as fortunate. But what does Islam mean by good? Well, Muslims, according to Patheos, believe that we are stewards and worshippers, and that we were meant to serve, obey, and be honest. People that follow this will find happiness and joy, and the opposite of this is bad. Next, we arrive at Judaism. Judaism is similar to Christianity in several ways, but the main difference is that they believe that God has not come to earth yet. The BBC says that essentially, in exchange for a relationship with God and everything God does, Jews keep his laws and bring righteousness into everything they do. The Jews believe they're the people God chose to set an example for the world, and they try to praise God with everything they do. God punishes the bad, rewards the good, and forgives those who are sorry. These are the basics of the religion, but when it comes to good and bad, it speaks extensively on the topic. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, an online Jewish encyclopedia, Jews believe that good and evil are ultimately from God, since he allows for any evil that does occur to occur. Man has an inclination to evil, but it can be controlled. However, man isn't evil by nature. It's the abuse of free will that leads to evil. Man's inclination, ego, and the rewards of evil in this world help evil to exist, but God gives people his commands and tools to help them stay true. We were made in the image of God, and therefore have the ability to discern between good and evil. But what does Judaism mean by good and bad? Well, Judaism's definition is pretty much the same as Christianity's outlook, along the lines of the Golden Rule. Basically, as stated by JewFAQ.org, a frequently asked questions database and resource on Judaism, we can be tempted to do good and bad, but we have free will and can choose between them. Also, some of the concepts of good and evil that Judaism talks about are similar to what Christianity says, like the fact that we have an inclination to evil that can be controlled, according to the Jewish Virtual Library. But essentially, Jews believe that good and evil exist, and people can do both because of free will. And last but certainly not least, we come to Hinduism and what it says about good and evil. Good and evil have a lot to do with the law of karma, according to the BBC, which states that every action has consequences. In fact, good and bad things happen not because of people, because of God, because of the law of karma. Hindus believe that reward and punishment don't always come in the life that causes it, which is why suffering is seen as punishment for the actions of a previous life. This implies that Hindus believe in a reincarnation cycle as well. Hindus also believe that everything has an eternal, perfect, and indestructible inner spirit called the Atman, which is born into one physical body, and when that body dies, it is born into another. Hindus call this cycle of rebirth samsara, and it is possible to be free from this reincarnation cycle and to reach moksha, similar to Buddhism, which is a state of being with Brahman, the Hindu god. But until one reaches this point, one is stuck in this reincarnation cycle. It is only when one's karma is resolved, or when one's actions and thoughts become clean, according to Himalayan Academy, a Hinduism database and encyclopedia, as well as an informational site for several monasteries, then it is possible to achieve moksha. These are the basic beliefs, but what does Hinduism mean by good and bad? Well, Hinduism's definition of good is more or less similar to the other religions I've gone over. Being honest, kind, respectful, serving and obeying God, etc. Bad is the opposite of this, according to the BBC. These religions all say somewhat similar things about good and evil, but there are some noteworthy differences. Basically, all religions that we've gone over say that people should be good throughout their lives, according to the BBC. Not believing in or following God being an evil is a common theme as well, as is the fact that evil is the cause of suffering. But how people became how they are today will vary as well, in addition to how to be free of suffering and evil. I've provided this information to you because 1, I thought it was interesting what other religions said, and 2, it might give you a little window of perspective into how other people around the world live. I'm not trying to convince you in any way to practice a different religion than you are. I just find this sort of thing interesting. I have my own opinions about human nature made based on my own religion, and you could too. But you may be asking, why did you decide to talk about religion in this project? Religion has a lot to say when it comes to human nature and why we have it. All religions say things about their definitions of good and evil, as well as indirectly give insight into why we have a choice, which both are necessary to think about at the very least before making conclusions about why we have human nature. But now we come to a huge question in this project. Is human nature bad or good? This question is seemingly simple at first, but like all the other questions in this project, it can become so complex. My main source for answering this was experiments carried out by colleges or other professional researchers. And the majority of these experiments involve studying babies, since babies have very little cultural influence and are a good model of our human nature. One experiment carried out by Yale tells us that babies do have a sense of right versus wrong, and they actually prefer right. However, another source, Psychology Today, a database on psychology and an informational site on neurological conditions, said that aggression is a natural trait of humans, and we do have parts of the brain, like the amygdala, and parts of our DNA, like monoamine oxidase, that make us aggressive. While aggression doesn't necessarily drive our social interactions, and it isn't our main behavior, it's definitely up there, and it's a big part of us. Philosophers like Hobbes and Augustine have said that we are initially self-centered, whereas people like Rousseau have said that we are good. However, Yale and Harvard conducted scientific studies on this topic and found that in every study, faster, more intuitive thinking was associated with cooperation, and slower, reflective thinking was associated with selfishness. These studies show that our first instinct is to cooperate. However, a friend once pointed out to me that it would make sense for the human race to be naturally selfish because of survival of the fittest and natural selection. And yet, someone could also argue it would make sense for one to make the same argument in the support of humility for the preservation of the entire human race as a whole. I present these arguments not to confuse you, but to help you form your own opinions and to point out counter-arguments that one must consider. Again, I have my own opinions made based off of Christianity, but I provide this information for those of you that aren't basing your arguments on a religion. I'm not suggesting you should base your opinions off of your religion, but you certainly can, of course. I just find this sort of data interesting and also helpful for those of you that might be taking a more secular route. I also put that survey out there, if you remember, that asked you guys if you thought human nature is good, bad, or both, and the majority of you said both. However, I was curious if any of you changed your mind after hearing my presentation or not. So I would really appreciate it if you guys could bear with me and take the second version of that survey when this presentation is over. But anyways, you're probably wondering how whether human nature is good or bad relates to the overarching question of why we have it. Well, let's provide some instances of the outcome of what a hypothetical conclusion might be for both human nature being good and human nature being bad. If one concluded that human nature is good, they might say, oh, well, since our first reaction is to do good things, we must have been designed to carry out orders or to serve someone, or something along those lines. However, if one concluded that human nature is bad, one may say, oh, our first reaction is to do bad things, so that might be used to cause new learning through mistakes, or the like. That's how one may use the question of, is human nature good or bad, to help one find an answer to why we have it. Now we come to a close. But first, our sources. Note that the majority of these sources I have here weren't used in my actual presentation. They just gave me a better idea of my topic. But now, without further ado, we come to our conclusion. This entire question of why do we have human nature is exceedingly complex to answer due to the fact that it spurs on so many other questions. I've deducted, since I'm a Christian, that our original nature was good, and will eventually return to good after the end of times and the beginning of eternity. Right now, in between, our nature is at first to do bad things. Yet our first reactions now can be fine-tuned, so that we can be better at doing bad things, or good things, so to speak, through experiences, what we take in, who we hang out with, as well as through prayer and reading the Bible. We were given human nature. We were given a choice, because it brings experiences and it brings life. Without our emotions and the ability to decide and choose for ourselves, we would be senseless robots, lifeless in a way. We also wouldn't truly learn anything. One of the best ways to learn is through mistakes. When we mess up, we realize what we did, and we learn what was wrong. It sticks in our mind a lot better. Also, one of the reasons God created us is to be in charge of all the other creatures and to have a sophisticated way of decision-making so that we could glorify Him with our own creations. It's like a dad giving his kid some Lego bricks for Christmas, and then the kid makes something out of them. He runs over to show his dad, wanting to show him the cool things he can make out of the dad's gift. So, we have human nature for learning, for life, and for a relationship. You guys may decide something different based on your beliefs or maybe based on the information I've provided you. Everyone's answer is different. It's been a long journey, but I've learned and grown so much, and I hope you have too. I realize that some of the information in this presentation may not seem directly relevant to answer why we have human nature, but I thought it was so fascinating to learn about the human brain and religions of the world, and to become more thankful for the things we take for granted. It's been a pleasure sharing my findings with you, but now we come to a close. I'm Jonathan Bell, and this is my personal inquiry project.